Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. We'll give a few seconds for everyone to properly join. Right, I see that Giel, our chair, has arrived as well.
Sorry, I had some problems with my computer. Can you give me sharing permission for the opening sheet?
Yes, I did. It's all yours to get us started.
Just a moment. Can you see the screen?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
And are we already ready for start?
Yeah.
Okay, welcome everybody to this this seminar of the Center for Development Impact called The Reality of Realist Evaluation. I welcome Mieke Snijder, who works in IDS, and Gill Westhorp, who is in Australia, in Tasmania, and Isabel Vogel. They will introduce themselves also when they will make the intervention in the panel. Just to explain a little bit what the Center for Development Impact is, we organize activities related with innovative methods for impact evaluation, innovation and learning and impact evaluation. It's a joint initiative between IDS, the consultancy ITED, and the University of East Anglia. And we are especially a community of practice exchanging about methods during seminars and during with practice papers and with IDS bulletin. The last activities in the last year very much geared around realist evaluation. As you can see in this this slide, we had a presentation in December about realist evaluation in mobile health, and there is a practice paper written about the realist synthesis for realist evaluation of participatory action research. And there is a practice paper written by, including Isabel Vogel and Mel Punton about realist evaluation. It is, there's also an IDS bulletin which will be, which is upcoming about private sector development, impact evaluation in inclusive business programs, where one of the conclusions of it is that the experiences which are presented in that IDS bulletin are very much experiences where people try to link impact evaluation not only with accountability to donors, which is often the reason for the funding, but especially to make it a learning exercise for the implementers. It's also clear that's not easy, but that increasingly people who try to do that use the question, what works for whom under what conditions, instead of the question, did it work or how much did it work? And of course, realist evaluation is very much a method which is developed around that question. So I look forward to this panel session where a lot of experience is on the table. We will have a short introduction by Mieke Snijder about what realist evaluation is, especially for people in this call who are relatively new to the approach. And then, and correct me, Mieke, if you changed the plans, but I'll give the floor to Gill Westhorp first. She will talk 10 minutes or so about her experiences of reality of realist review, of a realist evaluation. Then Isabel Vogel, and then finally Mieke again. Then we have quite some time, at least more as a half an hour for questions from your side. And of course, also between panelists. We hope it's a sort of a community of practice meeting. So there will not be a solution, but at least there will be inspiring ideas about how we can address the challenges of making realist evaluation a reality and a learning, a way of learning about impacts of interventions. So without much more, I will stop sharing and then I'll give Mieke the floor.
Great, thanks, Giel, and thanks everyone for joining. It's really nice to see such an international group from what I've seen in the chat so far. So I'm Mieke Snijder. I'm a research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies, where I'm in the participation, inclusion, and social change cluster. And my research really focuses on the evaluation of participatory processes. And I use realist evaluation in my work. And I wanted to start with a very brief introduction into realist evaluation, mainly for the people on the call who are not as familiar with realist evaluation approaches, and just share some of the key concepts and key words that you'll probably hear us talk about today. But as Giel was saying, most of the webinar will be talking about the real practical application of realist evaluation. So realist evaluation is a theory-based evaluation approach, but it differs from other theory-based evaluation approach in that it is firmly based in a realist philosophy or realist ontology about how we see reality. And realism sits very much in between constructivism on the one hand, which says that there is no objective reality and reality is completely what we construct it to be. And on the other hand, positivism, which says that reality is knowable and directly observable, and by doing controlled experiments, we can learn about this reality. And realism sits in between, where we say that there is a reality, but what we construct it to be is an important part of this reality. So the interplay between our construction of reality and the objective reality is what we talk about in realism. In terms of realist evaluation, I think one of the most important things always to remember is that it's very much about the question of what works for whom, under what conditions, how and why. And this links to the idea that in realism, we're very much interested in understanding why things happen and how things happen and in what context things happen. So I always like using this image of the iceberg to illustrate that we see, we observe things that happen in reality. So with interventions, when we implement an intervention, we see an outcome happening after the intervention is implemented. But then why or what is causing the outcome to happen is because of what happens underneath the surface. So all of the mechanisms that are taking place and that push the reality up. But the mechanism or the underlying causes of the outcome only happen within a specific context. And to illustrate that with an example, if I have a tennis ball in my hand and I release the tennis ball from my hand, the ball will fall on the floor. But then in realist, we want to think about what is causing the ball to fall on the floor. And this is gravity. Gravity then pulls the ball to the floor. So it's gravity that causes the ball to fall. But it only happens when I'm on land. When I'm standing in water and I drop a ball, the ball will not fall, but it will float. So the context of being on land is therefore essential for the ball to fall. So that's, very brief explanation of how the context and the mechanism link together. And realist evaluation works with a generative approach to causal inference, which is different to a successionist approach, which is very much about every time I see A happen and then B happens, I conclude that A must be causing B. So every time an intervention is implemented and an outcome occurs, then it must be the intervention that leads to the outcome. Or when there's no intervention taking place and no outcome occurs, we say that it's because of the intervention that the outcomes take place. Whereas in a generative approach to causation, it's very much more about understanding why and how things work. So when we implement an intervention in a specific context that then shows an outcome happening, what happens underneath the surface that causes the outcome to take place. So that's what we're looking for in a realist evaluation. So really diving into the explanations of how and why and for whom things happen. And to do that, we undertake a process of retroduction. So retroduction is the process of unearthing the mechanisms that are triggered by an intervention within a specific context leading to certain outcomes. And I already explained the other ideas around ontological depth. So that's the idea that underneath what we observe in the reality lay mechanisms that drive what is happening. Another important element, I think someone has their microphone on. If we can all mute ourselves, it might make the sound a bit clearer. The other important point in a realist evaluation is the use of program theories. So program theories, in its easiest way to explain, is that it's an explanation of how and why an intervention might work. And all interventions or policies or program start as a theory. So generally when people develop an intervention, we have an idea of why we think an intervention might work. It's the program theories that we're using for our evaluation. And they help us to get to the generative causation of identifying the underpinning mechanisms that create the outcomes. Yeah. And program theories are developed to be to different interventions in different contexts. So anyone who is familiar with some realist evaluation has probably heard about CMOs, or context, mechanism, and outcome configurations. And you'll probably hear us talk about that in our short presentations coming up. But to briefly explain this, the context is the condition which influences whether a mechanism sparks and which mechanism sparks, and also the extent to which different mechanisms might spark. And these are, for example, the characteristics of the individuals who receive the intervention, but also the facilitators who deliver the interventions, but also broader contextual elements such as the organization that the intervention is implemented in or delivered by, but also broader cultural, historical, political context. The mechanisms are the forces or powers that explain how and why change happens, and the mechanisms are the elements that causes the outcome to happen. And the outcomes are short, medium, and long-term changes, unintended and intended changes that result from an intervention. So to give it a brief example, so when we have an intervention, for example, that gives cash to families, there might be a context of having schools in the area, social norms about importance of education, that parents have no debt to pay off and children want to go to school. Then the outcome of the cash transfer intervention can be that children go to school instead. And the mechanisms that cause this is then that because of the cash transfers, parents have sufficient money to pay their bills and buy food, and therefore have the choice to send their children to school. But if the different elements of the context aren't there, for example, if parents still have a lot of debt to pay off, then they might use their cash that they received from the cash transfer to pay off their bills, and then children might still have to go to work. So realist evaluation, by breaking it down in the context, mechanisms, and outcomes in this way, really help us to dive into the explanation of why something works or why not, and how that interplays with the context. And this diagram is to highlight how the intervention and the mechanism happen on different levels, and how there's different levels of mechanisms, which are the light blue boxes that interact with the program activities and the individual's reasoning choices and norms to then generate the outcomes of the program. And I'm going to leave it here because I think it's interesting to spend more time on the practical examples of how we have applied realist evaluation. So I'll hand back to Giel.
Thank you, Mieke. Yeah, for the ones that are diehards in realist evaluation, this was obviously a good introduction. For the people who are new, it might also show that it is a pretty difficult conceptual approach also. So I'll hope that the panel will also give some examples and try to illustrate that it is also a practical approach and not only a methodological complex approach. First, Giel, you are very active in the realist evaluation scene and very much in the remises I don't know how you call it, the sort of the knowledge base around realist evaluation, where people can post questions and where often Giel gives very practical and short and useful answers. Giel, perhaps you can introduce you a little bit more what you're working on, and then give your reality of realist evaluation to the floor.
Thanks, Giel. I can certainly do that. I currently work at Charles Darwin University, which is located primarily in Darwin in Australia. But I work remotely and I live in Tasmania, Australia. We are a realist specialist unit. The team that I lead there is a realist specialist unit. We do realist research and realist evaluation. A lot of our work is in international development, but it's also in human services, community development, education, health, those kinds of areas for people in Australia, as well as in international development. So, and as you said, I'm a co-author of the Ramesses Standards, and I am still active in the Ramesses discussion list, yes. Shall I go straight to share screen and begin this little quick presentation? We were asked to focus our evaluations on our presentations, sorry, on particular questions. And the questions that we were asked to focus on related to how you focus a realist evaluation and how you disseminate the findings. And so, unfortunately, I'm not actually going to focus terribly much on realist evaluation. I'm going to focus on using a realist review to then focus an evaluation. And that's a fairly common way of going about it. I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which I am presenting and the Indigenous peoples of all the lands from which you are participating. I want to acknowledge the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research, who funded the project that I'm presenting, and the rest of the team who have been involved in the project, different people at different points in time for this particular project. And this project is looking at agricultural innovation platforms in development settings. So innovation platforms are designed to be multi-stakeholder platforms that bring people together to develop solutions to complex problems in development settings in agriculture. Over time, many different things have gone under the title of Agricultural Innovation Platform, hereafter AIPs. And so the first question that we were asked to address was to develop a typology of AIPs. And then once we had that in place, we were asked to conduct both a rapid realist review and then an evaluation to inform the funding body, which is a funding body for agriculture in development, to inform whether, when, and in what circumstances they should fund AIPs. But they were particularly interested in evidence in relation to innovation and whether or not innovation works differently in different kinds of AIPs, effectiveness, very common evaluation question, of course, sustainability of outcomes, and the diffusion of benefits from AIPs. And they also knew that there were some quite significant weaknesses with the evaluation of AIPs in the past. So they also asked us to look at how evaluation of AIPs could be improved. So there were key research questions all the way through that, from typology to evaluation, but the realist questions were only developed about the 4 boxes in the middle. The processes through which we worked and the products that were generated at the different stages. This project is still ongoing, by the way, and I can't share the most recent findings because we're still analysing them. But initially, ACIAR, that's the Australian Council for International Agricultural Research, provided us some initial literature resources. And it was in that inception report that we developed from that we developed our initial rough program theories. Initial rough is a quote from Ray Pawson, and that's all you're trying to establish at the beginning of a project. We developed an inception report, including those initial rough theories, and provided that to a group of key informants who provided us feedback. And as a result of that, the main change that we made to our initial rough theories was an increased focus on the importance of facilitation. And that focus on facilitation ran through a number of the theories. We then conducted very rapid, well, actually they weren't that rapid, but they were very small resourced realist reviews on the 4 topics of innovation, effectiveness, sustainability, and diffusion, and used those to refine our initial theories. And by that stage, we had also refined our first set of CMOs, context, mechanism, outcome sets. Configurations means the little sets of C plus M plus O. Then we had to focus the evaluation, and that's what we were asked to concentrate on this in this presentation. And what we did was develop a set of criteria for the selection of case studies that enabled us to align particular case studies to particular key evaluation questions. The evaluation methods were quite standard, other than they all had a realist focus. So we did key informant interviews for each of the cases, then a wider range of interviews with people who had been involved in various ways with the case study programs, a much more detailed review of the documentation for those particular cases, and we're currently in the analysis and write-up stage. And the products from the analysis and write-up stage will be case study reports with theory refinements that arise from that particular case, and a synthesized report with the overall theory in it refined. I did this slide rather than have a whole bunch of words on a page, but it highlights 3 of 5 main mechanisms that we found to be running through. We hypothesized on the basis of a little literature at the beginning, and then found to be running through all of the case studies. And they were increasing social capital, social and situational learning, and increasing innovation capacity. We found that access to knowledge and resources was, of course, critical for increasing innovation capacity and for improving social and situational learning. But the nature of the knowledge and resources was a bit different, depending on the nature of the group, so who the group members were, and whether or not the knowledge and resources or the social capital was being developed with people within the group or people outside the group. And when you had very multi-stakeholder groups internally, and or when you developed social capital with outsiders, then the nature of the knowledge and resources was more different than if you had, you know, groups which tended to be primarily a certain type of person, like farmers, for example, because there was less variation in their knowledge. And we also found that the nature of the action, this isn't published yet, so it can't be quoted yet, but the nature of the action seems to be slightly different. Where you have members of like type, for instance, you've got lots of farmers in the group, they tended more often to take collective action, and at least some of those collective actions seem to work by changing power relationships. A bunch of farmers together have the power to negotiate with a purchaser that a single farmer doesn't have. But where the members were of different types, so you might have had farmers and purchasers together, or farmers and policymakers and banking institutions providing credit, for example, you tended to get collaborative action where the actions needed to be mutually beneficial or they wouldn't be carried forward. Now, that analysis is mine. It's not the product of the project per se, but it just gives a way of demonstrating how you can show at a very high level of abstraction contexts, mechanisms, and outcomes. So context being in orange, mechanisms in blue, and outcomes in green, in ways that demonstrate relationships between them. And all of those two-headed arrows are intended to demonstrate feedback loops. None of those things, the causal directions do not go one way. And that, by the way, I think is true for most social causal processes. They're usually iterations with feedback loops involved. So one of the things that we found as we undertook the literature review was that we had in fact increased the number of CMOs that we were now considering, and they were much more detailed. That didn't help with focusing at all. And so as we entered the evaluation stage, we had to go through another refocusing stage. And this was for the evaluation of the case study programs. So we linked the case studies to the topology that we had developed back at the beginning of the project. And by doing that, we linked each case to particular aspects of theory that were particularly relevant for that case. So that was one angle for focusing down. We focused in part by focusing which questions we directed to which types of respondents. And that, of course, hails back to Pawson and Tilley right back at the beginning in 1997, pointing out that different people have different things to contribute to an evaluation by virtue of their role. And so we asked different people about different things. We also found that it was necessary to move to a higher level of abstraction. By doing that, we could bring multiple related CMOs together and talk about them at a slightly higher level of abstraction, while still acknowledging that quite detailed features of context could sometimes be significant in terms of determining whether or not a particular mechanism operated in a particular way. And one of the tricks that we've discussed as a way to help ourselves move back to that higher level of abstraction is to prepare a PowerPoint presentation before you write the report, because preparing a PowerPoint means that you have to pull out the main points and work out very succinct ways of presenting your information. We were also asked to focus on dissemination a bit. We've had multiple strategies and we'll continue to have multiple strategies. There was the initial inception report, which we used at the consultation with experts stage. There was a report on the literature review, and there'll be the set of final reports. ACIAR funds research, and they were really happy to include a requirement for us to write journal articles in the contract. And that's something that we're increasingly asking of our commissioners of evaluations, and many of them are happy to do it, I'm pleased to say. And we've had one, and we will do another brown bag lunch for ACIAR staff, so that at least the people within the funding organisation get the opportunity to have a chat with the research team about how we did what we did and what we've found. I'll call it quits there and just say thank you for your time and participation. Happy to answer questions later on when it is question time.
Thank you, Giel. Yeah, having the privilege of being the chair, one question shortly. You started with the evaluation question that they wanted to know in what context they needed to fund their agriculture innovation projects. Do you already have an example of a change in their fund modalities as a result of the research which you did? Or is it too early?
No, because it's too early. We haven't provided them with the findings yet. And well, they may have made changes, but they haven't told us about it if they have. And so we are not expecting that they would have made changes yet, because we haven't given them a report yet.
Okay, thank you. Now we have ample room for discussion after the panel. I like now to introduce Isabel Vogel. She's a consultant. She has been working in DFID or FCDO in the past, very much in promoting intelligent theories of change, which are useful for both accountability and learning. But I give her the floor to introduce herself a bit more in depth.
Thank you, Giel. Yeah, I also worked at IDS for about 11 years, so it's nice to be back talking to the IDS community. Yeah, so I'm an independent evaluations consultant. I do kind of work by myself, but also I associate with different companies. I'm based in Scotland, close to Edinburgh now, but it's really nice to see such an international group here. So yeah, so I've sort of specialised in theory-based evaluations and have dipped my toe into the realist evaluation approach, not as much as Gill, but it's really interesting, Gill, to hear some of the approaches and techniques that you've just been discussing, because I think we, through a lot of trial and error in the evaluation I'm going to talk about, kind of stumbled on similar things, but probably it was a lot more painful for us because it was the first realist evaluation we've done. So yeah, I'll share my screen now. So, right, are you seeing the presentation? And then, are you seeing the audience view or the presenter view?
Presenter view, it's fine.
The audience view.
Yeah, audience
We've
view.
got the audience view now.
Sorry.
Audience view, yeah.
yeah, so I've got the two screens. So yes, I'm going to talk about an evaluation of an FTDO program that was called Building Capacity to Use Research Evidence, BCURE for short. And the evaluation ran alongside the program from 2015 to 2018. As I was saying, I've worked a lot with different companies. And one company I've done most of the realist work with is the ITAD Limited, which is a company based in Brighton that specialises in monitoring evaluation, and I think is a partner in the Centre for the CDI group. And we've had sort of realist learning groups bringing together experience across different evaluations. So these are my acknowledgements that a lot of this experience that I'm going to talk about is actually written up in these papers. So what was BCURE about? So it was a £15 million project in 12 countries with 6 different program managers running sort of 6 different interventions across those countries. And the aim was to increase the capacity of government officials in low and middle income countries to access, appraise and systematically use evidence in policymaking. And the interventions were multiple. So some of the projects were using mentoring and training, others were developing kind of data and software systems in different government settings, and everything in between, fostering champions, using dialogues, developing tools and manuals. And FTDO wanted to know, what works in terms of building capacity for evidence-informed policymaking for who and how and why. So we, not having worked with the realist evaluation before, but we thought this was going to be the best approach to try and answer this question. The scale was somewhat daunting, 12 governments in 12 countries, and some of the interventions were kind of government-wide. And so that really posed some of the challenges that we then had to grapple with, as well as all the kind of political dynamics, as well as the technical ones. So the evaluation ran from about 2015 to, it says 2017 there, but I think we didn't finish the kind of final report till 2018. And it ran through 3 iterative stages. We developed a kind of a rough theory of change, as Gill referred to it, so really based on our own kind of understanding of the field and kind of looking and analysing the different projects and their interventions. And that gave us an initial set of ideas to explore. We then conducted a realist literature review, which actually opened up a huge domain. There were at least 5 different fields that were relevant, from management literature right through to political, governance and political science. When you're thinking about evidence-informed policymaking, a lot of it was very conceptual, not a huge amount of empirical information. So that kind of was one of the management challenges right from the start. But from that, we did manage to develop an initial set of CMO configurations. We found it useful, you can see the eye hovering there, but we found it useful to actually separate out the intervention features from the context, mechanism, outcome. I think that it's a practice that some authors suggest, and actually for us it was really useful because we were just trying to really understand, what's the difference between training and mentoring, for example, at least at this early stage. And trying to separate that out from the kind of context. We then went through iterative stages, 3 years of data collection, and at each stage we were refining the theories. This gives an idea of the kind of data collection that we were doing. We had a sample of 6 countries out of the 12, and we did annual evaluations of them all. It was also, had the accountability questions as well as the how and why questions. So that was kind of something we had to straddle, was actually establishing how the programs how successful the programs are being, as well as the realist side of things. But overall, I think we spoke to about 500 individuals over the 3 years. So we had an incredibly rich data set, and then being able to actually come back to the same settings over time actually proved incredibly useful to actually see how things were developing. I mean, one of the complications that we had was that what FCDO wanted to know, it was almost as if we fund a training course here, how is it actually going to change practice and establish evidence-informed policymaking as a routine, which is actually a very heroic theory that they had. So, you know, we really were facing kind of quite a, you know, it was a large-scale program. But we did get a lot of data. So just to kind of, you know, the first challenge, and we wrote this up in a sort of in progress paper, that was one of the links that I shared, was that we were just drowning in CMOs. I mean, there were just so many things at, you know, almost at an individual level right through to a kind of government system level. So deciding how many CMO configurations to investigate with limited evaluation resources was our first kind of big challenge. So, you know, we took quite a pragmatic approach that, you know, with limited resources, we proposed to the commissioner to, you know, focus on the least understood causal links. So, for example, there was, even though a lot of the interventions were about training and mentoring, there's a huge amount of literature already on training and how that can lead to behaviour change. So we thought, well, there's no point kind of covering that ground again. So let's focus on what's less understood, which is how does that kind of training or mentoring actually lead to sustained behaviour change over time? And then how does behaviour change at an individual level lead to organisational change? And then later on, in around the sort of second year, it became clear that the role of political incentives when you're in a government system and using evidence can actually create different incentives. We needed to sort of think about those. So, you know, we had to go back to the commissioner and say, you know, you can't know everything about how this is going to work or how this works. So we need to kind of prioritize and focus. And we made proposals and we had some dialogue, and you know, we actually agreed a set of priority CMOs that we would look at. The other kind of problem that we had, which again I wrote up in that paper, was that our CMOs kind of, we would put them together very carefully, very precisely, and then as we learned more and got more data, they sort of unraveled. We were like, oh, it's kind of not about that, or actually this works in combination with another mechanism. And so we had to sort of, you know, it felt like we had to keep restitching them together. I think one of the mistakes that we made was, I think, not treating those initial CMOs as a rough set of CMOs. You know, we were wanting to do the methodology justice and do it really well. So we did agonize a lot about that initial set of CMOs and spent a lot of time, you know, trying to be very clear in how we conceptualize them. And we actually got on a lot better when we just took them approached them more intuitively as a frame. We started to frame them as sentences and started to give them nicknames. For example, we had the eye opener, which was something that was coming up a lot in interviews, that people were saying, oh, you know, the course was a real eye opener or whatever. And later that actually rolled up into a mechanism, a larger scale, which I think Gill was also talking about, which actually became showcasing, which was about showcasing the value of using evidence in decision making. So yeah, as we became more confident, we actually were able to work better with them. Here's an example of one of our very long sentences. I'm not going to read it now, but I mean, it's just to show it actually sort of started to flow a bit better, you know, trying to sort of highlight the mechanism, but then also creating a bit of more of a narrative, I guess, rather than these very sort of categories that we were finding a bit, it was a bit constraining, trying to be very precise about them. I guess in terms of communicating, which was the other aspect that Mieke asked us to talk about, that, you know, we found that, you know, obviously it's got a fair amount of jargon, and communicating realist findings can be challenging to your commissioner and to the stakeholders, who kind of, you don't want them to have to completely submerge into the methodology to be able to understand what the findings are saying. So we felt we really needed to find a balance between sort of staying true to the realist approach and the concepts, and also telling a kind of clear story. But I think we ended up that kind of methodology, the realist methodology and the concept are the means, not the end. So the visualization helped, and we started in the sort of first report to really try and break out the CMOs, but it didn't really work. The commissioner just couldn't kind of grasp the overall story. You know, so that was too much methodology kind of front and center. So then we sort of started to use this concept of the ladder of abstraction, which I think Gill also mentioned about, you know, having to kind of abstract a little bit more, and trying to find kind of more flow and more narrative around the CMOs and the findings. So just very briefly, this is a concept from which I'm sure a lot of you may have come across from kind of social science analysis, where, you know, at the bottom of the ladder, you've got sort of specific explanations from a specific setting, and then you kind of abstract higher up to perhaps find more generalizable conclusions as you go up the ladder. One of the challenges is if you go too high up the ladder, you just get very generic kind of statements that don't, or insights that don't really help. So it's finding the kind of right level of abstraction when you're communicating with the trick. So how we used that was kind of, you know, we were thinking about how to communicate the findings in a useful way for the commissioner, but also future implementers, and starting at the bottom in each of our case study countries. So for example, this is an example from Kenya. We were really trying to answer the question of how and why did the outcome happen or not happen here. So the example in Kenya, you know, Giel was providing a kind of evolving technical support to an unpredictable policy process, and the underlined part is the context. It required developing tailored tools and inputs, which was the sort of intervention part. And the support was bolstered by the pre-existing trust and good working relationships, which helped kind of overcome the various obstacles. So that was the sort of context part. The other approach that we found useful was that actually when we tried to start integrating all of our CMOs into an overarching program theory, it was just too complex. You know, we had 6 countries and many different settings. Some of the interventions were happening in a single ministry or a single unit within a ministry. Others were working at the government-wide scale. And actually what we found about sort of, I guess, at the end of the second year that was the most useful was we started to group the different interventions at the kind of, you know, midway up that ladder of abstraction into archetypal impact pathways. So they were kind of partial program theories, but that allowed us to group types of intervention that were working in a different setting, and actually enabled us to provide still very sort of context rich explanations, but it kind of wasn't overwhelming. It was more manageable. So these were kind of archetypes. We had, you know, impact pathway 1 was support to a single ministerial unit, as I said. Impact pathway 2 was working at a cross-government scale, and then we had interventions that were supporting Parliament as well. So that's an example of how we visualize the cross-government approach, and we started to use a sort of more circular approach visually to give that sense of kind of feedback loops and a context that we found a sort of left to right visualization was less useful. And then the blocks in the center are the different kind of interventions, outcomes, and then the CMOs actually had the codes against them, against the arrows, to sort of express the CMOs that we were exploring. So that enabled us to do summaries across countries, and, you know, kind of really interrogating what was different, but also, you know, maintaining our sort of focus on for the C's and the M's and the O's, which we did kind of start to include in the brackets. In the reports, we also included boxes about the literature and the insights from the literature, which really helped to sort of say, okay, we found a mechanism that's called accompaniment. We can talk about it, how we're seeing it in our case study settings, but we at least have a sort of insight on what the literature is saying, that explain the concept a bit more. And then, you know, we were then able to go, you know, higher up that ladder to draw some conclusions. So our kind of CIMO 1, which was about an external partner being able to accompany reforms around evidence-informed policy making. So that was, you know, where there's genuine interest in the partnership from high-level government stakeholders, that creates incentives for evidence use, and there's a window of opportunity. You can see how we've moved quite a lot on from the training level. Then an external partner can accompany EIPM reforms and provide kind of tailored, flexible, responsive approach. And the mode of working is greatly helped by the presence of high-level, enthusiastic, committed champions. We've spent a long time thinking whether champions were a mechanism, were they an intervention, and actually in the end we decided they sat more in the sort of context side of things. And then, you know, that creates a conducive context for other mechanisms around EIPM to operate through encouraging the ownership and adoption of the government of that reform, and building trust for that partner to continue to work alongside government. So that's the accompaniment mechanism. Sorry, I should have said that before. And then in the end, we actually found, you know, a visual way of communicating really, you know, the whole sort of findings of the evaluation by the end of the third year, and keeping with this kind of circular idea of the impact pathways, we drew out the kind of mechanisms that were the most significant ones, the sort of self-efficacy at the individual level, showcasing the value of evidence, adoption, which I was just talking about there, which is when the government entity actually decides to own the new process, accompaniment, reinforcement, facilitation, and critical mass. And these are all the ones that we actually found good evidence for. And we were able to kind of develop quite action-oriented recommendations, which FCDO then translated quite effectively into a follow-on program. They distilled kind of a set of 5 principles and ways of working to inform the implementers in the next round. So this is my last slide now, I've probably talked for too long. So I guess the lessons that we learned were about setting boundaries early, you know, analytical boundaries early. So, you know, it is really demanding realist evaluation, and it's, when you're dealing with such a large scale or complex program, it's rarely possible to look at all of the dimensions. So as I said, you know, it was really what we found was where could we bring the most value, and that was unpacking the causal processes that were least well understood. Probably the most painful lesson was keeping it simple, at least at first. So, you know, getting to know the interventions really well, and developing rough theories early on was really important. I think we developed overly detailed ones that then proved to be irrelevant, or were actually subcomponents of larger scale mechanisms. And we did have a lot of agonizing, and I think it helps much more to view them as a sort of flexible framework rather than something quite rigid. And I think the other lesson for us was actually budgeting for the iteration with the commissioner, but also the program implementers. That really helped us to sort of revise theories and be able to kind of revisit the literature, but also then explore those theories with the different stakeholders. The other challenge we had over a multi-year evaluation was that the evaluation managers changed as well. So having the time to take them back through the approach as well. Yeah, that's probably the end of, I think, everything I had to say, but yeah, thanks.
Great, Isabel. That was really a nice example. Hey, my privilege of chair. So one question about, you had quite an intensive consultation with your audience or with your commissioners or with FCDO. Did you also experience some sort of interest within certain people within FCDO to promote their preferred way of working in future programs, which influenced the choice of your typologies and the choice of your analysis?
No, I thought you were going to say something else then. No, they didn't have a preferred way of working. It was an interesting program because it had started from the research side within FCDO, but the evaluation manager that we got halfway through came from the governance side. So he was quite critical of taking a sort of quite an unproblematic technical view of the IPM, which we had been trying to bring our kind of more research-oriented commissioners along with us. So I think that probably answers your question, that we were trying to challenge them a bit, that, you know, it wasn't just a technocratic thing, there was all these political incentives and context. And then actually when the governance advisor came on board, that that opened up a lot more and actually helped us to do a more insightful evaluation, I think.
Thank you. Mieke is the next and the third and the final one in the panel. Mieke already introduced herself. She's working in IDS, worked before in Australia, close to Giel. Are you going to share your screen, Mieke?
Yes. Yeah. Great. Thanks. Thanks, Giel and Isabel, for the great presentations before. I'm going to talk briefly about an ongoing realist evaluation within the Clarissa program, which is a program that looks at reducing the worst forms of child labor in Bangladesh and Nepal. Clarissa stands for Child Labor Action Research and Innovation in South and Southeast Asia. And the rationale of the program is that there is a weak evidence for what are the drivers for children ending up in the worst forms of child labor, and also what are some effective responses that we can implement to reduce children in the worst forms of child labor. And there's especially a lack of evidence from children's perspectives or other stakeholders within the system's perspective on what we can do about it. So the opportunity that Clarissa is taking is to innovate with new forms of participatory and child-centered programming to tackle the worst forms of child labor. So it's a large-scale program with different pathways to impact, looking at advocacy and different interventions. One of them is a social protection intervention that Giel is involved in as well. But the example that I'm using today relates to the systemic action research intervention, which very much looks at involving the children and other system stakeholders like business owners and families in doing their own research into what are drivers into worst forms of child labor, and for them to come up with their own innovative solutions, implement the solutions, and then reflect on whether they work or not. And
can you explain the abbreviations shortly?
Yes, I was going to get into that. So the LSCNA refers to the first stage of this process, which is life story collection and analysis, which is a process where the children, where we collected 400 life stories from children in Bangladesh and 400 in Nepal, where children tell their story up until now. And based on the stories, we then create a system map of the different factors within the system that lead children into the worst forms of child labor. And it's children telling their stories, but also collecting stories from their peers. And it's children themselves who analyze the 400 stories to create them into the system maps. And the system maps then help to identify the different factors that can be addressed to reduce worst forms of child labor, and the children themselves picked the factors that they want to address in then the PAR groups. So PAR stands for participatory action research, which is the process of children collecting their own evidence, developing their own innovative solutions, implementing the solutions, and reflecting on them afterwards. So that's the intervention that we are evaluating within Clarissa. To start, just as Gill was explaining with her program as well, we started with a rapid realist review, where our review question was around how, for whom, and under what circumstances participatory action research generates innovative actions. And framing this question in this way helped us to then identify the mechanisms, the context, and the outcomes. And taking a realist review at the start means that we can make sure that we build our program theories and our evaluation based on what is already known about how participatory action research works, and helps us then to build our initial program theories. So this is the diagram of the process that we took in the rapid realist review. I wanted to start with zooming in on building the initial rough program theory and how we went about that. It first started with our own experiences of participatory action research. So my background is in participatory action research. So based on that, I was already familiar with how some of the literature explains how it works, and familiar with the literature as well. And then using that literature, built some initial program theories, but also very much took a collaborative approach. So working together with the management team of the program, who are all experts in participatory research, getting their views on how they think participatory action research might work, but also working closely with the implementation teams in countries, so in Bangladesh and Nepal, and getting their program theories out of their heads. So it basically starts with the assumption that everyone who is involved in the program has some sort of assumptions or ideas about how participatory action research might work. And I wanted to learn from that. So in a training, we did an exercise where we asked each of the country teams to share their thoughts about how participatory action research works by thinking about it really in their country context to get to what might be unique about children in worst forms of child labor within their country context. And that's then by having the input from the teams and the management team and the literature helped to build the initial rough program theories that then guided the rest of the realist review by looking further into the literature, having ongoing discussions with the Clarissa team members on refining the program theories, and also using a steering group, which Isabel, Giel, and Giel were part of, and Marina as well. And that helped to really focus the review, but also to speed it up. So one part that makes a rapid realist review rapid is by using or by working with experts who can provide literature rather than spending a lot of time searching through databases. So then the rapid realist review helped to shape what I call the final initial program theories, which were quite generic program theories as they came from the literature, and to make them useful for Clarissa, we refined them to be more specifically relevant to the specific participatory processes within the program. So this is an example of how we refined it, one of the theories for the first phase of participatory research in Clarissa, where the children were collecting and sharing and analyzing stories from their peers. So breaking this down into the intervention, which are the boxes with the rounded corners, where we broke down the intervention into very specific activities as well, to have a very clear view of what the intervention is. And then the boxes plus the arrows are the mechanisms, and the boxes at the end are the outcomes that we identified based on the literature. And by breaking it down into these quite concrete intervention processes and mechanisms and outcomes, that then helped us to identify the data that we wanted to collect during this first phase of our participatory research. So we, based on the initial program theory, identified the different variables we wanted to collect for the intervention. So to check whether the intervention took place, what the context was, which at this stage of the program was very focused on the individual characteristics and facilitated characteristics. So focusing less on the wider context at this stage. And then the mechanisms and outcomes variables, which we collected through observations, children feedback forms, meeting notes, having review and reflection sessions with children as well as team members. And we undertook in-depth interviews with the children. And to analyze all of this data, we undertook a collective analysis workshop. So we worked together with the whole implementation team who facilitated the participatory processes and who documented the processes to then analyze the data collectively. And we wanted to do this collectively because we thought it was important to get the implementation team's experiences interwoven into the data analysis. And it was a process of inductive and deductive coding. So inductive by taking concepts from the initial program theories and identifying them in the data, but also seeing what else came out of the data to help us further refine the program theories. We had a team who did some pre-coding before we then looked at all of the coding in a workshop, which this image on this slide is showing what that looks like doing this practically in the workshop on Miro. After the collective analysis workshop, we were then able to refine our program theories about how participatory research works for children in the work forms of child labor to then inform our next phase of our evaluation. And to finish up, I wanted to just illustrate the iterative process of the evaluation, where we started building our program theories with a rapid realist review, which in itself was an iterative process with 3 stages of refining theories. We then collected data through the first phase of participatory research in the life story collection and analysis process, based on which we could then further refine theories, which we will then apply in the final stage of our evaluation in the participatory action research process. And I will leave it there. You're on mute, Giel.
Again, my privilege as chair. First question to you about the implication. Did this analysis of the work with the learning or the stories for the children, did it also result in adaptations of the approach?
The way that we trained the facilitators for the participatory action research, for example, was very influenced by what came out of the realist synthesis, because we found a lot of literature was about the role of the facilitators and how they can facilitate different groups and how the different ways of facilitating lead to different outcomes. So we refined our facilitation training based on that learning from the literature.
Thank you. we have a plenary discussion, so everybody can please post their question in the chat, because that gives a little bit of a grip on how to organize the discussion. I want to give Marina Abgar first the floor. She had 2 questions in the chat which were similar. Perhaps, Marina, you can explain your question. And
thanks, Giel, and thanks very much, Gill and Isabel and Mieke. Really, really interesting to see kind of the examples and how you're grappling with similar things. So I had a question for Gill and one for Isabel, but they are kind of linked. So maybe I'll put this to all of you. I mean, one of the key challenges is around this moving across the ladder of abstraction, right? Particularly when we're working in evaluating large, complex programs where you've got multiple interventions happening in different places. And it seems that there are slightly different strategies to how you've kind of navigated that. And obviously that iterates over time. But Gill, I was really interested in the typology you discussed, right? So you talked about developing that at the beginning of the program. And then later on, you implemented case studies, right? Which is a way to then sort of dig into the specificity around program theories or CMOs as you've developed them. So my question was how useful was the typology? Did it evolve through time? Or was it really at the case study level that you link it back to the specific kind of program theories? And I guess, Isabel, and thanks for the response in the chat about those archetypal impact pathways, did they maybe serve a kind of similar purpose around organizing? So yeah, hopefully that's a question that you can engage with. Thanks. Thanks, Gill.
Thanks for the forewarning about the question, Marina, and nice to see you too. The typology was a specific question from the commissioner of the evaluation. They already knew there were different types of things that were being called the same thing, and they asked, is it possible to develop a typology? So more for us, we said, yeah, sure, we can do that. And as it turned out, we could. Did the original typology hold true? Yes, mainly, but with some adaptation for some bits. And it worked better for some things than others. One of the commissioner's specific questions was, does innovation work differently in different types of AIP, innovation platform? And actually, no, innovation itself works in very similar ways across them, but the focus of the innovation is different in different types of AIP, and the who's involved in the innovating and the approach to innovation. So on the one hand, it sounds as though I'm saying innovation works the same in all of them, and on the other hand, I'm saying but the approach to innovation is different. It was more about what were they innovating? So are they, in some cases, for example, they were trying to roll out particular agricultural approaches that are have better livelihood outcomes for farmers, but are also better for the environment. And so they had a set of innovations they wanted to roll out already. And there, the innovations were actually about methods for rolling out rather than about new innovations that would answer specific problems in agriculture in particular areas. Whereas some of the other innovations were really about, we've got this really specific problem and we need to bring together a bunch of different knowledge sets in order to develop a solution for it, which is what innovation platforms were originally designed to do. So we did find that program theory did link back to the typology, and some of it changed over time, but not all, with extra evidence, but not all of it. What we mainly found was innovation wasn't all that different. There wasn't that much evidence for sustainability or for diffusion of outcomes, and what contributes to effectiveness did differ by the type of AIP. So that in itself is probably, you know, it's a step forward from where they were before. Somebody else, while I've got the floor, somebody else asked, what is a brown bag lunch? My apologies for the jargon. It's the nickname given in Australia to everybody brings their lunch, brackets, in a brown paper bag. Because that's what our school lunch bags used to be like when you bought your lunch at the canteen in Australian schools. It always came in a brown paper bag. And you eat your lunch while you listen to a presentation, and then there's a bit of a conversation after it. So it's just a bring your own lunch presentation. So that's both my questions answered, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Gill, and thanks, Marina. And I think we arrived at the impact pathways kind of at the end of quite a, you know, complicated, laborious process. I think we also tried to use typologies around the interventions at the beginning. And it was really this thing that you were saying, that, you know, there was a lot of things that were called training, but actually the content and how that training was delivered and what was included and who was included really differed. So we found that, you know, those more sort of superficial typologies were not so helpful, but that's why we included the I in our CIMO, because actually what was going on in that intervention was, even though they were called the same thing, were quite different and different mechanisms. You know, some were training over 6 months and some were training over 3 days, and you were sort of seeing different effects happening. I think, as I answered in the chat, our original program theory had, you know, this capacity development framing that, you know, there was individual level, organizational level, and then the sort of more system institutional level. And we kept that running through for quite a long time, but we found actually it meant that we had to keep abstracting things, and actually where a mechanism was creating both, you know, change at 2 levels, it kind of just wasn't helping us, you know. So it may have been sparking individual change, but was also leading to some organizational change where you had cohorts and clusters of people working in a different way. So we sort of stumbled towards this a typology of intervention settings. What we were seeing was that they were different entry points into, you know, say a government system. So it might start one intervention is working from cabinet office downwards, trying to create, you know, a full reform around evidence-informed policy making. Others were working, you know, sort of a more individual level up. So that ultimately proved to be a more useful typology of these kind of entry points and settings, and breaking it out into these impact pathways that seem to be intuitively more or less the right level of abstraction. And then your other question about sort of how the stakeholders and the implementers engaged with it. So every year we had a workshop with the implementers, and it was a key part of our data collection, was actually testing our CMOs and our emerging theories with them. And I think, you know, it resonated with some more than others. I think it's quite difficult sometimes for implementers to abstract from their work, but some people it really clicked for them, and, you know, and they saw their work differently and actually started to do things a bit differently because of that. So yeah, that kind of varied, I think. But yeah, in the end, that was the most kind of focusing on useful communication. Those impact pathways that were sort of partial program theories proved to be useful, but we didn't get to them till the end, if that makes sense.
There are 2 other questions, totally different questions, which I like to combine. Ines Arevalo asks about the linkage of realist evaluation within other type of data collection or other type of impact evaluations. And Jackie Cameron has a similar question about if you have experiences where realist evaluation is one of the mix of methods in a impact evaluation instead of a standalone example. And examples given seem to be pretty standalone realist evaluations. Do you have experience with how you can combine realist evaluation in what could be a bit more conventional impact evaluations, where people also want to know about the importance of their contributions or the extent of their contribution? Perhaps let's go. I see Isabel in the screen. So Isabel, you first, perhaps.
Yeah. So BCure was that combination. It's just that it was kind of qualitative all the way through. But we had 3 evaluation questions. One which is, to what extent were the outcomes achieved, and then what was BCure's contribution to that, and then there was the sort of how and why question that we applied the realist approach to. And I think again, there was a lot of learning around that, analytically kind of trying to figure that out. Was first of all establishing the extent of the outcomes, and then the contribution, which we had to do a bit more of a contribution analysis on. So there was quite a lot of analytical burden, I guess, in trying to answer those 3 questions. But I think approaching them in that order, what was the outcome, what was the contribution, and then how and why actually enabled us to maintain the realist lens through them all. But it was all kind of qualitative, because establishing outcomes around practice change and framing change and reform was not something that you could really do any quantitative work on. But we did combine it in the BQ evaluation.
Gill, have you experiences with how it can be linked to the question of importance or magnitude of impact, and discussions around prioritization of interventions?
I've been advisor to a couple of projects that have had realist evaluations as a subset of a larger impact evaluation. I haven't conducted any myself, because I have the luxury of only doing realist work. The other part of I think it is possible to integrate realist and quasi-experimental designs. And I worked on one research project like that for World Vision, where we looked at the impact of child sponsorship. And that it was actually quite useful to integrate quasi-experimental and realist approaches, because it helped us look at effect sizes in ways that you can't in a purely realist evaluation. You need a comparison group to be able to say whether or not you've got this particular type of data. There is, of course, debate about whether or not you can do that with realist evaluation, with RCTs. Is there such a thing as a realist RCT? I'm in print in the camp that says no, there's not. I'm not sure that I agree with myself, and I'm still waiting for the right opportunity to put that to the test. In terms of, Jackie, the other part of your question was about, can you use, other than a rapid realist review, can you use some other kind of rapid evidence review to inform program theory? My answer would be, you can use whatever you can do, but the warning bell is, unless you read like a realist, you won't see the evidence about mechanisms, and that will make it harder to develop a realist program theory. So I would just simply not put the word in when I was talking to the commissioner about it, but still continue to read like a realist. And reading like a realist, I think, is a skill that once you've got it, it's actually hard to lose it, and it's incredibly useful. So I think you can go for it.
Thanks, Gill.
Gill, perhaps on this, about your thinking as a realist, but doing something more mainstream at the same time, perhaps is also relevant for that discussion about quasi-experimental. So if you still have as your analytical focus that you want to explore configurations of factors and meaningful advice for implementers about what works for whom under what conditions, isn't it then that all methods can help? That there is no rigid division between, or because often it appears that there is a sort of division between more quantitative approaches and more qualitative realist approaches. Well, I think myself that the difference between collecting data and finding patterns is something different than analyzing them and concluding with realist type of insights.
Very big question. Can I do a couple of short, sharp and shiny bits? First of all, let's not confuse realist with either qualitative or quantitative. Realist work should ideally be mixed method. Secondly, one of the difficulties with doing RCTs per se is that you can't test whether the mechanism fired or didn't fire when you don't have the intervention present. So I think there are some methods that you can't use in their original form within a realist evaluation, but you can adapt many methods to make them consistent with realist evaluation. So I would say there are some boundaries, but they're not absolute or rigid. And the third thing that I would say is that I don't describe realist work as being purely configurational. I think it is true that you usually end up with multiple contexts being necessary for any mechanism to operate. And I think it is true that most outcomes require multiple mechanisms to fire in order for the outcome to be generated. But I think that is different from the configurational logic that underpins some other forms of analysis where mechanism is just missing. And if you're using a method where mechanism is just missing, then I think, and you want to do realist work, then you have to find a way to put mechanism back in, at which point you move from configurational to generative. And you have to work out how you're going to manage the differences in the analytic methods and in the description of what you've found in such a way that you don't have to be, an expert in research methods for people to be able to understand the logic of what you've done and the limitations to using the different methods. So that would be my version in a nutshell. I'm actually writing about adapting methods to use in realist approaches at the moment. So I did not ask Giel to ask that question, but I almost could have.
No, thank you, Gill. Yeah, Ines, perhaps you can unmute yourself and ask your question. You wanted to continue on this. Can you, or not? I'll read your question.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks. I mean, it's not a question. It was just maybe clarifying my earlier question in response to something that Giel just said. So it's just that I'm currently working with in an area where there is a lot of RCTs and a big knowledge gap is always, why some benefit more than others, why we see a lot of heterogeneity. And so I was thinking that realist type of evaluations could be really useful in trying to unpack that. So we may see a lot of impact, but we see that some people benefit more than others. So it wouldn't be to sort of explain the mechanisms within those that didn't take part in the program, but rather to try and understand, what are the conditions under which certain people appear to benefit more than others. So that was sort of the clarification that I was sort of providing in case it might be helpful in addressing this issue of mixing different approaches. Thank you.
Thank you, Ines. Now, I'm also from a more quantitative background, but obviously very mixed method in practice. And I think it's always that if you do more quantitative work, that you have always, you look for patterns, you look for associations, but they are spurious. They don't mean anything if you don't have a causal mechanisms which explains it. And they can be just accidents in your data. So you think always about mechanisms which are in place, which can explain the patterns which you have, and using quantitative data to get more idea about differences in contexts, which are important could help. And even I think RCTs perhaps is one way of it, but there are lots of more use of survey and explorative analysis of survey data. So not the with and without situation, but just making sense of diversity between characteristics of respondents and outcomes, which I think could very well be linked to a realist explanation. We are 9:30 in the UK. I don't know where in your country we are, but it's more or less the time that we planned to finish this CDI seminar in this panel discussion. Perhaps Mieke, for you the floor, you were the organizer and the lead in getting this done. Perhaps you want to say something?
I was just thanking everyone for their time, especially Gill and Isabel for taking the time to join us this morning and share your valuable insights. And Giel, thank you for chairing us, and everyone for joining and sharing your interesting questions. We've recorded this session, so we'll share the recording with everyone afterwards. And feel free to get in touch with any other questions that you have about realist evaluation. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Great. Thanks for all the really
Mieke.
interesting questions.
Thank you.
Yeah, indeed. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.